Whisker was a creature of comfort. He loved the warmth of his grandma's lap, the gentle strokes of her hand on his fur, the sweet aroma of her baking that always filled their cozy little house. He was a plump, fluffy ball of orange and white fur, his emerald eyes sparkling with contentment. Life was perfect. Grandma's house was his haven. Every corner held a memory, every piece of furniture a familiar scent. He loved their routine, waking up to the smell of her oatmeal, lounging on the windowsill watching birds, and curling up beside her as she read in the evenings. Whisker purred with delight, his world a symphony of simple pleasures. Then, one day, everything changed. The world shattered. The warmth of the house turned cold, the familiar scents stale and lifeless. Whisker waited, his tiny heart heavy with a grief he couldn't comprehend. He didn't understand where she had gone, why the house remained eerily silent. Days turned into nights, and the silence remained unbroken. The food ran out, and hunger gnawed at his belly. The once familiar sense of home turned cold and foreign. He was alone, lost in a world that no longer made sense. Driven by desperation, Whisker ventured outside for the first time. The world was a cacophony of noises and smells, overwhelming his senses. Cars whizzed past, their horns blaring, a stark contrast to the peaceful quiet of his grandma's house. He was a tiny speck in a concrete jungle, fear and confusion clouding his emerald eyes. He wandered aimlessly, his once glossy fur matted with dirt, his stomach growling. The playful curiosity that once defined him was gone, replaced by a dull ache of loss and a growing ember of resentment. He had loved his life, and it had been cruelly ripped away from him. The streets were harsh. Whisker, once pampered and loved, learned to scavenge for scraps, to avoid the larger territorial cats. He was no longer the chubby, cheerful cat who basked in the warmth of his grandma's love. His body grew lean and wiry, his movements honed by survival. He discovered the truth about his grandma's absence by accident, overhearing snippets of conversation from people passing by. A hit and run, they said. A reckless driver. A life taken too soon. A burning rage ignited within him, hot and consuming. It was a rage born of grief, fueled by the injustice of it all. The world, once a source of comfort and joy, now seemed like a battleground. Every car that sped past, every screech of tires felt like a personal assault. He would sit for hours on street corners watching the traffic, his emerald eyes narrowed, his heart a cold stone of anger. One particularly bleak night, as rain lashed down and thunder rumbled overhead, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall and imposing, shrouded in a dark coat, the man emanated an aura of quiet strength that drew Whisker to him. He reminded him of his grandma, of safety and warmth. Hesitantly, Whisker approached, his meow a raspy whisper in the storm. Section 4. The Shadow of Justice. The man, whose name was Elias, saw in Whisker a kindred spirit. He, too, knew the sting of loss, the burden of grief. He recognized the flicker of vengeance in the cat's eyes, the raw pain that mirrored his own. He took Whisker in, offering him shelter and food, and a different kind of warmth, the warmth of understanding. Elias's small apartment became Whisker's new haven. It wasn't the cozy, sun-drenched haven of his grandma's house, but it was a sanctuary nonetheless. Elias, he learned, was a man of shadows, a silent guardian who walked the line between right and wrong. He spoke little of his past, but Whisker sensed a depth of sorrow in his silence, a shared understanding that transcended words. One evening, Elias brought home a worn photograph. It showed a smiling woman, her eyes crinkled at the corners, her arms wrapped around a giggling toddler. Whisker recognized the love in her eyes, a love that mirrored his grandma's. It was Elias's wife, he explained, taken too soon by a drunk driver. That night, as thunder rumbled outside, Elias shared his story. He spoke of his thirst for justice, of his pursuit of the man who had robbed him of his family. He spoke of the emptiness that remained, even after vengeance had been served. His voice was low and steady, devoid of self-pity, yet filled with a grief that resonated deep within Whisker. Section 5. The Scent of Revenge. The shared grief forged a bond between them, strong and unyielding. Elias saw his own pain reflected in Whisker's eyes, and Whisker found a purpose beyond his sorrow. He would help Elias find the man who had taken his grandma, the man who had left them both lost in a world that no longer made sense. Elias, with his network of whispers and shadows, tracked down the driver. His name was Thomas, and he lived a life of careless indifference, haunted by his actions yet unwilling to face the consequences. They found him in a dingy bar, the air thick with the stench of stale beer and broken dreams. Thomas, a shadow of a man, his face etched with guilt and fear, drowned his sorrows in cheap whiskey. Whisker watched him from the shadows, his body taut, his emerald eyes burning with cold fire. Elias confronted Thomas. His voice was low and dangerous, his words laced with the weight of their shared loss. He spoke of the shattered lives, the futures stolen, the pain that lingered like a festering wound. Thomas, consumed by his own demons, barely seemed to register his presence. Whisker could sense Elias's struggle, the internal battle between vengeance and forgiveness. He rubbed against his leg, a silent reminder of the promise they had made, the shared grief that bound them together. He wanted Elias to find peace, but he also knew that some wounds ran too deep, some debts could only be paid in kind. Section 6, A Reckoning and a New Beginning. The moment stretched, thick with tension. Then with a swift, decisive move, Elias moved towards Thomas. Whisker, a furry shadow, darted forward. He leaped onto the table, his claws extended, a hiss erupting from his throat. Startled, Thomas stumbled back, knocking over his drink, his eyes wide with fear. He slipped on the spilled liquid, his head striking the edge of the bar with a sickening thud. He lay still, his chest no longer rising and falling. Silence descended upon the bar, heavy and absolute. Whisker stood over Thomas, his body trembling, his fur on end. He had delivered the final blow, his sharp claws exacting a life for a life. But instead of the anticipated satisfaction, a wave of emptiness washed over him. He looked at Elias, his emerald eyes searching for answers. Elias knelt beside him, his face etched with a mixture of relief and sorrow. He placed a hand on Whisker's head, stroking his fur gently. "It's over now," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're safe now." Whisker leaned into his touch, a low purr rumbling in his chest. He had avenged his grandma, but the victory felt hollow. He understood now that revenge, however justified, couldn't bring back what was lost. It couldn't erase the pain or fill the emptiness left behind. He curled up beside Elias, drawing comfort from his presence. He was no longer the pampered house cat, nor the vengeful stray. He was something different now, a survivor, a protector, a loyal companion bound to a man who understood the depths of his grief. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the grimy windows of the bar, Whisker knew that he had found a new purpose, a new home, a new beginning.